John's not moving.
This is easier than the budget, I think. Good morning. There has been some discussion over the last few months about some storage concepts. One of the South County agencies has expressed interest in storage in the basin, and that sort of generated some discussion amongst staff and the producers and the board members as far as, well, what is an appropriate storage range and operating range of the basin, and how much room is there for any kind of storage program? And so that discussion, I think, needs to be had first, and then we can talk about storage remaining after that. And so just to review with the committee, back in 2007, staff basically evaluated storage in the basin, how we calculate storage, change in storage, and we developed a recommended strategy, which the board did adopt back in 2007. And John just presented that earlier in terms of different target levels where we would like to be, and if we get to certain overdraft levels, where we try to refill the basin and so on. So that strategy was established back in 2007. And so it's good to go back and review that because it's now been 11 years since we did that. And just to give you an idea of the schedule, we have met with the producers a couple of times to kind of get input from them in terms of how we would go about evaluating our operating strategy, and of course then provide updates to the committee as well. And our goal is to, by June, have essentially a recommendation to either change the strategy or keep it as it is. So I'll go through a few scenarios with you. It often boils down to what kind of drought situation or undersupply situation might we have that could dictate how much is a good, safe operating range for the basin. That's what we've tried to have for the last 11 years. So we'll go through some of the scenarios, and this is the report from 2007 that we prepared. And some of the things that we did, the first half of the report was all about calculating how do we calculate storage in the basin. And we do groundwater contour maps, and now we do 3 different aquifers. Before 2007, we did one contour map for all of the aquifers. We kind of melded it together, and it wasn't a very precise way of doing it. But based on all this great data that we have, we can actually do contour maps for the 3 major aquifer systems. And so, and we also calculated what constitutes a full basin. We always said it was 1969. I mean, I was 9 years old back then, and I don't know what, but it was a wet year, and the basin was determined to be full, and that was the benchmark, by gosh. And so we thought, well, let's go back and reevaluate that. So we did. And we also developed an assessment of what is the lowest we want to go in the basin as far as overdraft. And we estimated that based on seawater intrusion and land subsidence concerns, that 500,000 acre-feet is probably the lowest we would like to go. We could potentially drop below it for a very short period of time, but we'd like to bounce back up. So 500,000 is always, since this report came out, has been our bottom. So that's what we did. We looked at these things, and we feel as though we're very confident that our full basin benchmark in terms of what we estimate as a full basin is still valid. We see no need to reevaluate that or recalculate that. We still feel very comfortable with our methodology of calculating change in storage each year with the 3 different aquifers. So we feel there's no need to change that methodology. And also the 500,000 acre-foot bottom we think is still a valid, reasonable benchmark to manage to for the reasons below, the seawater intrusion, land subsidence, and pumping intakes. So that's basically half the report. We feel very comfortable that those issues are still being handled properly in our current policy. So what has changed since 2007? Doesn't sound that long ago, but a lot of things have changed, and we mentioned a few things were brought up just a few minutes ago. Water demands in the basin have gone down about 20% since 2007. People are conserving, and so we are seeing lower demands than we did 10, 11 years ago. Base flows, that was brought up. They've gone down by 65,000 acre-feet. Even more if you go back 15 years ago. They were at 150,000 acre-feet a year, like Mike said. But in the last, since 2007, they've gone down by 65,000 acre-feet. But GWRS has come online. It's a huge offset to those reductions, well, to at least the base flow reductions. We've noticed, we've talked about that we've seen some increased underflow into LA County. There was a Super and Loop program that Matt had with us where they stored about 16,000 acre-feet, and that took up some storage. Well, that program's gone, so we don't have to worry about that. And most recently, the basin sustained a 5-year drought and did pretty well with only 160,000 acre-foot of storage change after, from what the article said about a month ago, the worst drought since the year 1400. So DWR came up with an estimate, looked at tree ring research, and estimated that this last 5-year drought is the worst drought in hundreds of years. So we did pretty well through that. So this is the kind of the schematic that John shows quite often, showing our target range in green there between 100 and 150,000 acre-feet is our happy zone. That's where we would like to be. If we could always be in that range, we would be well positioned to get through various drought scenarios. And the question is that still a valid range that we should be shooting for? Is that still a good place? Is that over-aggressive? Is that over-conservative? That's what we're asking. And of course, as you get lower in the overdraft, as the overdraft increases, then we start to take more aggressive measures to refill the basin, as John has mentioned over many meetings. So what we need to do, though, is we need to look at what are the budget factors that affect our preparedness for drought. You know, what are all the intakes and inputs into the basin, as well as potential storage programs that might affect how much we need to reserve in storage. I won't go through all of this, but to think about some of the considerations as far as that upper target range, what are the factors that might affect that or be affected by that? Well, certainly the higher we are in the basin, we're more well prepared for drought, definitely. That helps reduce seawater intrusion. That's very important. But we do know that also probably increases some losses to LA County. You know, so there are some downsides to keeping a full basin. It might, certainly in some cases, if we have a really full basin, we start to see mounding in the forebay where we start to see reduced percolation rates. That's only in very high conditions in the basin. Also along the coast, we can't inject as much of our GWRS water at the barrier, so we have to send more water up to the forebay. So there are some downsides to keeping a very, very full basin. But it factors on the other side as far as affecting drought preparedness is how much water do we need in storage? How many years of a drought should we assume for a planning horizon? We think 5 years is still a good planning horizon. We just had a 5-year drought, a very severe 5-year drought. It's not that it's impossible to have a longer drought than that, but we still think that's a good time horizon to be planning in the future. How severe is the drought? I mean, there's minor droughts and major droughts, you know, as far as how dry it is, and we're having a very dry year this year for sure. And water demand. That really affects our resiliency to get through a drought. If your demand is very high, then that's harder to manage as you go into 3, 4, 5 years of drought. Met water availability, a key factor, and so on. The board policy to maintain a BPP of 75%. That certainly is something, if that's going to be a hard and fast rule, which I understand it's not, it's just a policy, the board can change that as it potentially might this year or this coming year. But those are all things that we need to consider when we put together these scenarios. And I'm going to show you 4 scenarios at the end here of different drought ideas. So first we'll look at water demands. Looking forward into the future, we don't see large percent increases in water demand looking out in the next 10 years or so, which is a good thing. I mean, that makes it easier for us to plan if demands are not increasing really rapidly. What's also interesting is that a large percentage of our demands are already being met by local supplies, GWRS, base flow, storm flow, incidental recharge. All of these add up to local supplies that we aren't dependent on outside area or geographic areas to bring in water. Just the upper two bars are the MWD supplies into the basin. So what are our questions that we want to answer? It's really how much storage do we need to get through a 5-year drought, assuming the committee is comfortable with the 5-year drought as a planning horizon. And is there any storage left over for other programs? Kind of first have to answer the first question and then figure out what is there still some room for different storage programs. And then, so the question is, what scenarios and assumptions should we use for different planning for different drought scenarios? And so I'm going to start with our 2011-2016 drought, but I'm going to normalize it to today's numbers. So I'll start with what happened in 2011-16. As I mentioned, it's the driest period the DWR says it occurred in California since the 1400s, so it's pretty drastic. In our area, we had 55% of historical rainfall during that 5-year period. That caused reduced incidental recharge and storm flow. Those are the two factors that are affected by rainfall. And base flow decreased by 65,000 acre-feet during that period. It went from 100,000, so it was already sliding down from 150,000. It started the drought at 100,000 acre-feet of base flow and continued down to around 65,000 acre-feet during that period of time. So we were seeing our supplies of the river water going down as we had the drought. So then, on the good side, GWS ramped up from 70,000. Well, it ramped up from 70,000 to 103,000 acre-feet. Met purchases varied during that time. It wasn't a constant. And total water demands also varied to some degree. And in the very last year, the state mandates caused people to reduce their demands by 17%. And then the BPP, interestingly, increased from 65% to 75%. So the district was ramping up the BPP a couple percent each year during the drought, from 65% to 75%. So a lot of factors going up and down. And so I wanted to put together a scenario that said if we had the drought of 2011 to 2016 again, but under today's conditions, what would be the change in storage in the basin? So what actually happened is the basin dropped about 161,000 acre-feet during that drought. That's what happened. If you take out the 16,000 acre-feet that Met pulled out of the conjunctive use storage, the drop would have been about 145,000 acre-feet. The question is that still reasonable? If we had a drought again, same drought, same situation, but we normalized everything to today's conditions, would we still lose 145,000 acre-feet or something close to that? So here are the assumptions that we put together for this new drought, new 2011-16 drought, is we maintained the rainfall as occurred in the drought, which affected the storm flow and the incidental recharge, but we set the base flow at 65,000. It wasn't going from 100,000 down to 65. We set it at 65,000 for every year because that's close to today's conditions. We set GWRS at 103,000 because that's what it produces now. We set Met purchases at 65,000 acre-feet, except for the very last year we dropped it to 45,000, assuming they might cut back on us in the very last year. And pumping, we kept it 75%. As you recall, the BPP was going from 65 to 75 during the drought. Well, in this case, we kept it at 75% for the whole 5-year drought. And we eliminated any effects of the CUP storage program. We just took that out, so we don't have to worry about that. So based on all those assumptions, each year of the drought, we put together a budget. This is our water budget, the inflows, and then the pumping is the outflow. And at the bottom is the change in storage for each year. And at the end of 5 years, we estimated that the basin would have lost 161,000 acre-feet, which is really close to the 145,000 that the basin really lost. So, in other words, under today's conditions, it looks like we could sustain another 2011-16 drought, assuming we started at a good level in the overdraft. We would estimate we might drop 161,000 acre-feet of storage. So that's pretty good. That's good news. It means based on these assumptions, which we think are reasonable, we would probably get through another drought if it were like that, if it were to happen again. So let's move to another scenario. So this is a 5-year drought, but in this case, in the last 2 years, we reduced the Met purchases. So in years 4 and 5, we assumed Met purchases and Met water availability were less. And we also assumed that the state did not mandate demand reduction in the last year, because that demand reduction did help us tremendously from basin storage. That reduced demands, that allowed the basin to recover that 5th year. Well, in this scenario, we assumed that that didn't happen, and people's demands continued in the 5th year. So just those little changes caused the change in storage. Instead of 161,000 acre-feet of decreased storage, it's almost 250,000 acre-feet. So it just shows you change a few assumptions and you will get a difference at the end. So, but still, 250,000 acre-feet, that gives you an idea of another 5-year drought scenario that you could end up with.
And
yes, sir. Yeah, please.
That's all assuming 75% BPP during those years.
That's right.
There again, the board has a policy. If we hit certain trigger levels, we would actually go to a reduction. If we hit 300 minus 350 on the overdraft, the board policy says to try to purchase more Met water and reduce the BPP.
Absolutely.
So we have control over that very large number. I mean, obviously that's disturbing. That's half the storage of the basin.
Exactly. This is just if we wrote it out and didn't change that BPP, that's might be where you end up. So absolutely, that can be changed. So here's the third scenario. A 5-year drought. This one was suggested by one of the producers at our last meeting, is to do the 5-year drought, but then after, add 2 more years to the end as if Met water were not available or were reduced in the last 2 years. So we thought, sure, this is just an easy spreadsheet analysis. It's not hard to do these. We could do a whole bunch of different scenarios. We don't want to bore people with too many different runs, but we thought, okay, let's see what this one yields. So after 5 years of drought, which is what we just did, and the earlier scenario, we simply added another 2 years, not drought, so we used average rainfall, average recharge the next 2 years, but we did maintain low, basically half or a little less than half of the Met purchases that we would normally like to have. 65,000 acre-feet is what we normally like to purchase and budget for, but we cut that down to 30,000 those last several years. We kept demands, no state-mandated water conservation, basically demands were maintained, and the BPP was also maintained at 75% all the way through. So at the end of 7 years, we have basically a 300,000 acre-foot drop. So this is a 7-year scenario, just as a what-if analysis, basically. Last scenario. This is looking out in the future when GWRS final expansion is finished. So out into the future, our long-term projections are that base flow may get down to around 52,000 acre-feet versus the current 70,000 acre-feet. So we went ahead and assumed base flows of 52,000 acre-feet in the top row there. And then we used the drought, storm flow, and incidental recharge from the 2011-2016. So this is a severe 5-year drought for the storm flow and the incidental recharge assumptions. But you'll see GWR is there at 134,000 acre-feet, so it's up at a higher level. And we assumed that we were buying Met water as our usual 65,000 acre-feet, except for the last 2 years, where we assumed that it was severely cut back in the last couple of years. And we increased the BPP to 80% to account for the GWRS final expansion coming online. So we just used an 80% assumption, and we also used future demands, 80% of future demands. And so again, at the bottom, we total up the change, and after 5 years, we estimate a change of storage of about 254,000 acre feet. So not too bad given a severe drought and future demands and 80% BPP. So here's a chart that kind of totals up or graphs up the 4 different scenarios we ran, and so we can see under the actual or the drought we actually picked up storage in the last year of the drought, but the net reduction went from, as I mentioned, 200,000. Well, if you started at 200,000, that was the assumption. I just said, let's just start all these drought scenarios at 200,000 acre feet of overdraft. Where would you end up if you started at 200,000 acre feet? So under the first scenario, you end up at 361. And scenarios 2 and 3, because remember, one is a 5-year scenario and the other one is a 7-year. So they both end up at 448,000 after 5 years, but if you go another 2 years, you end up down here at 500,000. And scenario 4, you end up at 454,000 because it was a total 254,000 acre foot decrease. Again, this is assuming the board maintains either a 75 or an 80% BPP, doesn't make any adjustments. Those are all things that the board, if we follow the existing policy, if we get down at 300, 350,000, we would be normally aggressively trying to bring that storage up and potentially not maintaining a high BPP. But that's a board decision. So I just wanted to show you, given those assumptions, where you might end up. So that's what I have to present, and it's interesting because it does show that if the board doesn't take any actions and just maintains a certain BPP and these other assumptions hold true, you will continue to decrease storage in the basin. There's that is what would happen. So, and it doesn't show that there's a whole lot of room under these scenarios for storing a lot of extra water in the basin, unless we start at 100,000 or we start at 150,000. If you start the drought up in this target range where it's our current policy, then you certainly won't end up as low. So it's all a question of where you start that drought. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Not really a question, but more of a statement. I appreciate the worst case scenario that we're looking at. But, after the historic drought that we've had, what it really summarizes for me is that 10 years of historically low local rainfall out of an 11-year period is not a good thing. Right?
Absolutely.
Sure, thank you very much. How much of the base flow decline can be attributed to project implementation upstream? Is there an answer to that?
Gosh, I don't know if I have a percentage. Demands have reduced in the Inland Empire as much as well. So we're seeing wastewater inflows decreasing on their end. But I don't know. Greg, do you have any sense of, that is certainly one of the key reasons. The upstream agencies are definitely recycling more of their water and diverting it and recharging it and using it. That's less wastewater coming to us. So that's a key factor.
My point in the question is that this, it's been a favorite topic of mine, is the integrated regional water management plan for ourselves, and the project implementation upstream is depriving us of the water that otherwise came to us, and we're paying for it, and we're paying for the projects upstream via the water rates that we pay here locally, which in some way, shape, or form make their way back up to those agencies through SAPA and others to implement those projects. So I don't know if, Mike, you wanted to respond.
Yeah, and that's why the earlier presentation that Greg gave about the IRWM and the Orange County IRWM was a result of that concern. We continue to express those concerns at SAPA, particularly when it comes to the scoring of projects where upper watershed recycled water projects are able to score high on greenhouse gas emissions because they say that they're lessening the amount of imported water that comes into their agency, which is a true statement. But if you look at it on a watershed-wide basis, it's not. It's decreasing theirs, it's increasing ours. So we continue to make those points, and that's about really all that we can do per the judgment. It's within their rights to to recycle the water for their own purposes. There's really not much we can do to that. I would guess, if I had to guess, the number you were asking for the amount of recycled water is probably in the order of maybe 50 to 60,000 acre-feet of water that they've recycled. It's not the full amount. During the drought, we saw their flows went down also. In fact, it's kind of interesting. I had heard that potentially IUA is trying to purchase some wastewater from Rialto because IUA cannot meet the demands of their non-potable system because of reductions in wastewater in their area. So they may have overbuilt their infrastructure a little bit. But no, we continue to make those observations when grant monies are at stake in the upper watershed, and that's about all we can do. On the other side, you may think, well, if there is going to be future development, it is going to occur in the upper watershed. So they're, taking a look at glass half full. There may be there may be some increased discharge of the river. They're going to always recycle as much as they can, but we continue to monitor and be actively engaged in what's going on in the upper watershed, and because as you point out, it was the main source of recharge for the basin for many years.
And then in the staff report on page 1, you identified that demand reduction is down 20% or 100,000 acre feet. It would be also interesting to know, as part of this discussion, had that not occurred, what the RA would be if we had that additional demand. Obviously, if we're selling more water, the replenishment assessment would be lower. Perhaps we could include that number in the future discussion. And then also in the 4 scenarios you present here, a column to the right, as to in each of these scenarios what the RA would be under those scenarios would also be helpful for the board's discussion, as the result of all of these planning decisions result in the cost to the consumer. One more comment, and then I'm just going to make a statement. The 80% BPP that we're aspiring towards as the GWRS final expansion comes online, the assumption there is that that the producers will be able to take enough demand off, or extract enough water out of the basin. So for the consideration of the board and our future deliberations, I think that we should make it a policy goal and we encourage the producers to develop the extraction facilities necessary to take that demand so we can pay for the facility that we're building, and we don't end up in the same position as the IEUA. And then just finally, regarding this topic of conservation, I think is very important, and it's something that's lost, and it's often put off to the public that this is free. It is not. Recently, during the drought, everybody in this room knows that Metropolitan Water District paid more than $500 million for folks' turf removal projects that installed plastic grass in the homes of Newport Beach and Irvine. Those homeowners now, as by my own observation, are replacing that grass because the ultraviolet light makes it look aesthetically pleasing, and so that chemical carpet is now being rolled up and thrown into the dump. It's worth talking about that. When we talk about conservation, we talk about all these other programs. That cost is passed off onto the backs of the lowest of our citizens, and it costs them the most. The poorest people in our communities don't get plastic grass. The poorest people in our community pay for the water that pays for the plastic grass. So when we hear objections about the cost of water, it's worth talking about projects like that in my mind make absolutely no sense, because the $500 million there would have paid for half of the project in Huntington Beach to desalinate water. And in that case, we would have had more water, not less. So it's just a political statement I'm making there, but I think it's highly sensitive, and it needs to be considered in the scope of all of these discussions. Thank you.
Any other questions, comments, board?
Well, no, this was really helpful, so thank you, Roy and staff, for that. What you said that when we start getting to the 350 level, we have that tool, right, to be able to go ahead and reduce the BPP. What other tools do we have available to us that could help us address, sort of getting below that level? What triggers that would obviously trigger it, but what other sort of, do we have, again, speaking about conservation, information being pushed out to the public and letting them know that this is we're getting to crisis mode and we're having difficulties, but what other sort of efforts will we have and ways to go ahead and address
Well, the main
that problem?
tool we have, of course, is the reduction in the pumping, the reduction, reducing the BPP as far as the impact to the basin. Obviously, we're always trying to look for other ways to increase the supply of the water, whether it's through recycling, and I mean, there's no other project in the world that is going to do more recycling than the one the board is considering here with the final expansion. Beyond that, our efforts with the Corps for stormwater capture, trying to develop other sources or being able to capture other sources of water that are currently wasted, whether it's some sort of stream flow that we can run through the sanitation districts, whatever it is, trying to use water more than once, I think, is or would be our goal to try to increase that supply to the basin. So it's kind of supply, but really the main tool the board has is the ability to raise or lower the BPP. And that can be done any time during the year. That's the other thing to keep in mind. When the board sets the RA next Wednesday night, that can only be done once a year. When they set the BPP, that can be modified anytime during the year. So we have that too helps the board kind of react to whatever conditions may be existing at that time.
Right. I mean, having that ability is our best tool, right, to address the problem. But maybe what we could do is come up with maybe a palette of different, issues and or ways to be able to address this. So as we look at this more, because it does become more of a reality if we see these years being stretched out. Just to say, okay, this is our strongest element, I guess we have in our toolbox. But maybe there's some other efforts that we can do, and the ones that you just mentioned, storing, purchasing when we can, all those things I think fall into efforts that we can take. So it's
Okay,
helpful.
sure.
Dennis? Anybody in our audience? Yes.
At the risk of offending any sensitivities, I want to point out that the board did not follow their board policy during the drought. In fact, they raised the BPP. So I'm not very hopeful that if we had another drought, it would be the same thing. And the reason is because the pushback from the producers on raising rates to their customers. So it's really a disincentive in that respect. And I also want to point out that this agency applied for a huge reimbursement from MODOC for a project that you would propose. I don't know if you ever followed through with it, but I know that I remember attending the meetings where you had a landscape project being applied for reimbursement.
That was actually through the city of Anaheim, and we did receive it.
So
Yeah.
basically,
Was it turf replacement or was it drought-resistant plants? Drought-resistant plants. I don't think.
No, we didn't. No, we took advantage of the turf removal, and then we re-landscaped it with drought tolerant along Warner Basin, along La Palma.
Also, during the drought, you're right, we did, the BPP went up some, but that was to make us financially whole, because everybody forgets that the other side of conservation is you use and buy less water, but our costs do not go away. So, I mean, I think that's what we're always balancing. So it wasn't, it's just not one thing. I think we just forget to look at the other side. Yes, John?
Yeah, I think, I don't know how many meetings ago it was, but I think Director Dwayne, when he was talking about the cost of conservation, as he does almost every time, asked the staff to do some sort of study on that, read still in the works, because every time Director Crane, as I pointed out in my publication, Troops and Boys repeatedly have analyzed that his stats are wrong, and so I'd like to see what the board thinks, or maybe a staff thinks that, and I wonder if there's any plan to follow through on that. His request.
You've got too much on your plate now.
Not at the moment, yes.
Okay. Any other questions? Any comments from the board? No? Okay. Moving on to, how about if we put items 1 through 13 on the consent calendar? Is everybody okay with 13 going on the consent calendar? No, I'm just directing right now. And then, do we have any director's comments? Okay, General Manager?
Just a couple quick things. I'm looking at the website and noticed, and I had anticipated that on our counter for water produced from the groundwater replenishment system, we just passed 250 billion gallons. So a quarter of a trillion gallons have been produced in a little over 10 years. That's testimony to Bill's department, the water production department, and keeping the plant up and running. The other thing, the state just came out with their intended use plan for SRF funding, and it does look like they have classified the groundwater replenishment as a fundable project. So we may not. John's been looking at it. It looks like there actually is funding. We broke it into the treatment plant and then some of the work, the flow EQ down at Plant 2, and it looks like the flow EQ is eligible for funding in 18-19. The other project, the treatment plant, it looks like is on funding for the following fiscal year. So that looks like it'll probably fit in quite well with our funding scenario, with being able to get the WIFIA money first and then augment that with the SRF funding. So if indeed that's true, that's excellent news. That means that we have secured low interest funding for the entire amount of the project. And we're still pursuing grant funding also. We're not giving up on that. We're going to have a very nice OWOW submission for the final expansion. So we'll see how that scores.
On that good news, we are adjourned.
And I'd like to encourage all of the producers to go over to MODOC right now. They're considering their budget. And I submitted a letter on behalf of the district that so far they've ignored. And anyway, that's why I plan on going. I may be a little late for the producers meeting.